Hello everyone, my name is Mulverhill. I'm working at the University of British Columbia here to present on some recent work with terrestrial photogrammetry and a boreal mixedwood forest. And the reason that we're studying these mixedwood forests is certainly because of the amount of land that they represent, particularly in the northern hemisphere. A lot of Canada, as Karan mentioned, is covered in these mixed and complex forests. And these forests are characterized by having a wide array of different species, different structures, and different habitat types. So for that reason, we need to continue to develop quick and cost-effective strategies for monitoring and for inventorying these forests. So one such technique, digital photogrammetry, has been talked about a couple of times today so far. Essentially creating 3D point clouds from overlapping sets of images. A lot of the times you use aerially on drones, airplanes, to assess cover height, things of that nature. But more recently, being used terrestrially with ground photos to assess individual tree parameters. However, these things, using the terrestrial photogrammetry often requires hundreds to thousands of images. And one thing that we are trying to do with our research is to use advances in camera technology, such as wider fields of view, to be able to take fewer photographs and increase the cost effectiveness of this technology. Ultimately, we'd like to try to overcome these challenges of occlusion and lack of visibility with using these wider fields of view, and also potentially to link it to airborne data sets. So, as I mentioned, we're doing this in mixedwood forest in northern Alberta, Canada. It's the same slave-like research forest that Karan was talking about. So, the high rates of disturbance, both standard replacing disturbance and smaller localized disturbances, in addition to the variety of species here, make it really interesting, a really interesting sort of mosaic of different habitats and species to study. So we're working with these two scales of measurement that I'll talk about today. So we're looking at a few individual trees that were felled and measured for taper. And we also have a plot scale as well that we're looking at. So the goals of the individual tree portion of the study were to derive the DBH, the taper measurements of the stem, as well as the total volume. So as I mentioned, these cameras that we're using are spherical cameras, meaning they take sort of like a Google Street View image, a complete field of view, 360 degrees. And we're using those on a telescoping pole here to be able to take photos further up the stem than just on the ground. And this pole has two cameras on it mounted at a fixed distance away from one another that we can use to scale the point cloud. So this is just an example of one of the images that was used during testing. So it's 360 degrees complete field of view, but we've also got two of them mounted on this pole at the same time. So this is sort of our processing pipeline here. First we use AgiSoft Medshape to generate the point clouds. So for each individual tree we used a set of 12 of those spherical images, using that scale bar as well. Next, we reduced the noise and extracted diameters of the stem using Computree, which has been developed by the French Forest Service. And finally, because there could still be some errors in the fitting of those diameters of the stem, we did this taper curve matching approach using all possible taper curves for the entire area. So the taper curve, for those that don't know, is essentially just predictably how the diameter of the tree decreases as you move up the stem. And there are these tapered curve models for combinations of species, deviation, height for the entire study area. So in some cases, not necessarily at the individual tree level, but we could get a partial point cloud from the stem, or one that when we fit the circles to it, there's some errors in fitting those circles around stem points. So what we did was we built a database of all possible tapered curves, and we essentially fit those diameters that were output from CompuTree to find the taper curve with the lowest possible residual. And finally, we wanted to assess the accuracy of these measurements from measurements that we took in the field with a felled tree. So as I mentioned, we have this taper curve database with combinations of species, deviation, height that give us the diameter at different heights of the stem. In this presentation, we'll be comparing these two methods. So we have this taper curve matching approach here, and then a conventional inventory-based method of just putting the DBH, the height, and the species of the tree to derive the taper. So this green curve here is this taper curve matching approach using the point cloud, and then the inventory, the conventional inventory method. So you'll notice, unfortunately this was covered up, but you'll notice that for about the first 10 meters, which corresponded to roughly 30 to 35% of the stems, the RMSE of the photogrammetric point clouds was more accurate than using the known deviation height. And based on the trees in the study, about 50% of the total volume of those stems existed in this portion of the stem. And the lowest 50% of the stem, which kind of was the point of overlap for some of these models, 80% of the total volume of the stem existed in that portion. And when it came to the total volume, the taper curve matching approach was slightly less accurate than just using the known deviation height, but these weren't significantly different from one another. And finally, using just extracting the deviation from the raw point cloud gave us an RMSE of about 1.2 centimeters. So as I mentioned, the taper on the lower portions of the stem, something that could potentially be used in assessing the merchantability of the tree and understanding how much merchantable wood is in those portions. If you're interested, there was a paper that we just published on this part, testing some other methods as well. That was in the Annals of Forest Science and it's open access. So next, sort of testing similar approaches on a plot level, where we tested it with a systematic placement of different camera locations, and we also did it across this gradient of different species and densities that I mentioned before. So these are the kind of the things that we were trying to detect all the trees and estimate their deviation and volume as well. So we're using the same sort of processing pipeline here, but we have to add this extra step where we merge trees together that we're seeing in two different locations. And the reason that we have to do this is because of this systematic placement of the camera locations that I mentioned. So across our 11.2 meter radius plot here, which is the red circle, we have 17 different camera locations that are spread out evenly. And what that gives us a set of 6 images at each of those camera locations. We're using 102 of those spherical images on each plot. And then we're processing, in order to save time and also to remove any noise from points that were too far away from these known locations, we're processing each of the locations individually using a buffer of 5 meters around each one. And then, as I mentioned, merging trees that may have been seen in 2 locations together. So first, the detection. we noticed these patterns of the tree detection. For example, while dominant or co-dominant trees were really accurately detected, we noticed that these intermediate and suppressed trees that could have a lot of branches or could have been immediately next to a much larger tree had lower detection rates. Additionally, smaller trees were significantly less likely to be detected, and this was true across almost all the different species. In addition to that, when we're looking at the trees that were detected, again, the larger trees with potentially greater spacing in between their neighbor or fewer branches down below to occlude points around the stem. Larger trees were predicted generally with higher accuracies than smaller ones. So this is the overall deviation that was estimated on the 6 plots. So across these different species and densities, we were able to detect about 78% of the trees and get to an RMSE of about 16% for those trees. So across all of these different stand types, as I mentioned, we achieved these accuracies with those. So to kind of sum up here, as I mentioned, we were trying to sort of reduce that processing time and that computing time. So for the individual trees, spent about 13 minutes total from acquiring the images to processing the point clouds and matching them to those tapered curves. And then on the plot, using 102 images, achieving those accuracies using about 80 minutes of time going from taking the images to processing them. So as I mentioned, we're using, trying to use these advances in the fields of view for the cameras and things like that to try to overcome differences in allometries and occlusion in terrestrial photogrammetry to try to be able to integrate these things into enhanced forest inventories and potentially into airborne data sets as well.